Hi, my name is Janice Drew, and I'm the founder of this group, the Nonprofit Executive Directors Group, to help current, former, and aspiring nonprofits discuss different topics and meet up to create partnerships and grow as similar to the startup or full profit environment, creating this forum of networking for nonprofit leaders. We're very happy to have this room here today, and I would like to start by thanking our sponsors. My company, Inkwai, is the Start Meeting sponsor, and we pay for the meetup group. And we have Julie Livingston, who couldn't be here. She's our beverage sponsor. Danette O'Connell is our program and staff sponsor, and then we have Baruch College. So I'm going to turn it over to David Hoffman. He's our host today at Baruch.
Thank you, Janice. Welcome to Baruch. This is the School of Public Affairs at Baruch. We are one of the largest public affairs schools in the country. We have 850 graduate students, approximately 200 undergraduate students. We offer a Master's of Public Administration degree, and we're very happy to have you. I wanted to introduce Edgar Zavala, who's the Director of our Office of Executive Programs, because in addition to offering our Master's of Public Administration degree, we also offer a number of smaller non-credit programs that might be of interest to some of you.
Thank you, David. Thank you all. Welcome again to the School of Public Affairs. I'm Edgar Zavala, Director of Executive Programs, as David mentioned that. And you're probably very familiar with the type of programs that usually universities have. So we have the master's degrees, right? So the usually credit programs. But we have non-credit programs. These are usually called certificate programs that you can either take them before your master's degrees or after your master's degrees to specialize yourself on different skills. So that's what I want to talk to you about a little bit. And Buju Olebola, who works in my office, is going to pass around this flyer, which basically summarizes the different options we have. But when David asked me and he invited me to this meeting, which sounds awesome and very nice to meet you and all these people working here towards this particular topic, I thought, how can I bring it to the table? So I thought about ACT-CODE. Why not at least ACT-CODE, right? Why not something a bit? So I'm going to write here behind me just a code that you can, if you're interested in taking any of our programs. And yeah, this is a very simple code to remember, which is David Hoffman, who invited me, so that's the first. The second one is Meetup. And then 1.5. And with this code, you're going to get a 10% discount in any of our certificate programs on the School of Public Affairs, non-credit ones that we're passing around the full price. So if you're an executive director, board member, or a senior staff, middle manager, we have a couple of certificate programs that may be of interest to you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some that I have heard that may be of interest for you. One is fundraising, and there are a lot of universities, Foundation Center, I heard over there, some people. I used to work at Foundation Center too, so about fundraising, I think that's one of the major issues, major concerns for nonprofit organizations. So if you're aware of this, around 81% of private funding comes directly from individuals, and the rest is a combination of foundations and corporations. So you can go to the Foundation Center, many of the institutions, to get trained about how to write proposals, right, how to respond to that. But something I realized, and we realized here, is that there's these 81% of individuals that you can solicit funds from. So we created and developed this program called Individual Fundraising. And this is a certificate program that basically will train you and this is not for people that are just getting into fundraising, this is for people that have been in fundraising already. So to specialize on individual solicitation. So if you're interested, that's what we call individual fundraising. We have an intensive one, and we have classes of like improvisation, communication. These type of classes that you need, right? You know that you're doing individual solicitation. That's an example of that. We have another couple of interesting programs that I want to talk to you about, which is professional presentations. How many times we, middle managers, senior managers, executive directors, you get approached by NY1 or by someone and tell you, you have 5 minutes, could you come up and give a 3-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute presentation? And you're like, oh, sure, let me do that. So we developed this certificate program in order to give and help develop the skills of individuals, managers, to come up in 3 minutes, in 5 minutes with a really good speech give the right message to the right audience, have the enough tools and strategies to go and feel confident when you're making a presentation. I usually tell this, basically, you're going to be able to be trained and very comfortable to be, I can do a TED Talk. So that's what I call what you will come as the outcome of it, taking the professional presentation. And we have other ones like outcome measurement. You may be familiar with that. We don't call it outcome measurement, we call it impact measurement report. We also have that there. Something that is included in our certificate programs. All the textbooks, all the handouts, that's something that I usually get. Hey, Hector, besides this price, what else do I need to pay for or whatever? Don't worry, nothing. The textbook is included. And also the time we have the author of the textbooks teaching these classes. So if you have any questions, my contact information is in the bottom there. You have this goal. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks a lot, David. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I hope if you want to use this opportunity, feel free to contact me. I'll be very happy to talk to you more about the programs. Thanks a lot.
So we're going to go right into introducing our panelists. We have Professor Dan Williams here from the Baruch College School of Public Affairs, Alan Friedman with the International Rescue Committee, and Jeanette O'Connell with Triumph International Business Consulting. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll jump into some questions before we start your presentation.
At the International Rescue Committee. The International Rescue Committee is a humanitarian organization that works in over 40 countries worldwide. My principal background is in executive level leadership at the country level. I run a number of country program operations for the IRC and other NGOs around the world, primarily in crisis and conflict zones. Spent the last 6 years in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. And over the last 2 years, I've been working on this innovation process, looking at how we can take principles of co-creation and innovation and bring them into the development of humanitarian context.
I'm Dan Williams. I've been a professor here at Baruch for 20 years. It's the end of this year. So before that, I was the college director for the Medicaid program of Virginia for 10 years. That's pretty old. Anyhow, so that wasn't my first job in life, and in that experience as a public director, I learned quite a bit about budgeting, which is how all people often find out about budgeting. They end up doing. Well, I now try to help people do a little bit better budgeting before they get in the job. That's a lot of what I do.
Hi, I'm Jeanette O'Connell. I help nonprofit partner grow, and it's about with finance and operations.
So, David, can you pass the microphone around?
Hi, I'm Tom Tolentino with the Statue of Liberty Lasana Foundation. I'm Gary Oppenheimer. I'm the founder and executive director of AmpleHarvest.org.
Should we be talking about what these organizations do, or just
I think we want to move it quickly around this time with the room, and then we can network afterwards.
Hi, I'm Mark Willey, a principal of MRW Consulting in New Jersey.
I'm John Miller. I'm with Gray Matters, a pro bono services group.
Hi, Charles Fuchs, a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch.
My name is Archie Chube, and I'm a professional.
Lisa Ernst, Executive Director of Savvy Ladies, which is about financial empowerment for women. Melissa North, I'm a nonprofit consultant. I was most recently at the ASPCA for 13 years.
Tanya James, CEO, founder of Global Fashion Technology Federation.org.
Simatu, I work at Office of Executive Programs, Baruch College.
John Casey, I teach nonprofit management here at Baruch College.
Hey, I'm Russ Winkler, most recently with Foundation Center, and I'm looking for opportunities in nonprofit.
Mark O'Connell, I recently returned from a trip to Ukraine, and I'm looking to continue my relationship with hospitals. I volunteer
Vera Winterwell. I recently founded Truly Well, which is a new center.
Hi, Carol Seeger, the COO at the Center to Advance Palliative Care at the Mount Sinai School.
Tomás Rivera, founder of philanthropist.org, Army kids with their higher education.
I'm Walter Kamun. I'm president of Civil USA Older Society.
I'm Elizabeth Barker. I work at New Classrooms Innovation Partners.
Buchi Polaspora. I'm doing my MPA and also the Office of
Hector Zavala, Office of Executive Program, School of Public Affairs, Federal College.
Jack Krauska, faculty in the School of Public Affairs and Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management.
Maywan Parsmar, Chief Undergraduate Assistant at the School of Public Affairs.
Great representation from Baruch. So let's jump right into some questions for the panelists. Professor Williams, why is budgeting important for a nonprofit?
So there are a lot of reasons why budget's important, but we will focus on just a few areas. First, frequently when you prepare to go into your next level of activity, you think you know what you're going to do. You've got some people to do it. You have a general plan of what's going to happen. What you may not realize is that until you sit down and carefully think through the steps to move forward in your process, you may not really know what you're going to do. You're not fully prepared. So budgeting originated, and not originated. When budgeting came into the United States, the main purpose of budgeting was to make thorough plans of how you're proceeding to what you're going to do over the next period of time. Typically, a budget period is a year. And I'll tell you a little story. Budgeting in the United States originated in government, not in the private sector. And it came in first through the cities, a little bit later through the states, and in the 1920s in the federal government. Moved from there to the private sector. Federal government before 1920s had the problem that no matter how often and how carefully money was appropriated to agencies, the money ran out before the year ran out. So budgeting became the method of making sure that that didn't actually happen. And it was about figuring out how you're going to use the money before you use it. That's what budgeting is for. It also solved the other problem, or helped solve another problem, which is that the agencies, in this case the nonprofits, have somebody else who's also interested in what they're doing. For the agencies, that was Congress. And the budgeting becomes a device for communicating between the agencies, or between you and your board, and your other stakeholders. Often you have stakeholders outside of the board. It becomes a device to tell them what you're planning to do and to get them committed to your action. So it's a communication method to help you get your stakeholders become engaged in what you're doing and committed to actually doing it. So there are a lot of other reasons, and that's a great thing to do, but those are two great reasons to budget.
Thank you, Professor Williams. Alan Friedman, what's the biggest mistake organizations can make in approaching strategy?
The biggest mistake you can make is chasing trends and not understanding your core strength as an organization. And the corollary of that is that you listen to ideas and don't look inside first and figure out what you're really, really good at and how to scale them.
So, Jeanette, what is the best way to implement a strategic plan?
So I've been helping people do strategic plans for a while. I see a lot that people create strategic plans because they have to. Because the board wants it or their investors. But what I see happen is it sits on the shelf and it doesn't get it. So what I do, what I help nonprofits do, is I project manage the strategic plan. So I assign people to do the project. I create a timeline. I create, okay, here's our beginning, here's our end. I show them a timeline on a monthly basis, and then make sure that they stick to it. But I also have people who I assign to it also so that you delegate across the table to help implement. So not just the executive director is implementing the strategic plan. So if you delegate and you stick to a timeline, and it could be normally strategic plans are, depending on who's doing them, a year to 3 years. But normally 3 years. So you strategic plan, but you prioritize what needs to be done the first year, what needs to be done the second year, and then strategic plan or project management.
Great. So I have a question for all three of you. What's the number one tip you give our leaders for strategic planning and budgeting?
Well, I'll start with that. So I'm going to give you my best tip for budgeting. So whenever you create a 3-year budget, I do budgeting and strategic things. So whenever you do a budget, make sure that you know inside and out where those numbers came from, because you're going to be asked about them. You're going to have to explain them, and a lot of people just pull numbers high in the sky, and you can't do that. You have to know your numbers inside and out, where they came from, how you created them, and what made those numbers up. So make sure you know those numbers.
Yeah, my philosophy is always to think strategically but act opportunistically. And what that means is that every organization needs a strategy because it needs a framework in how to proceed. But every organization builds value by acting opportunistically or acting tactically and understanding that. The other thing that I would say that is extremely important, which I'm going to get to when I do about a 5-minute presentation, is bias is a killer when it comes to strategy. And what I mean by that is, do you have the boldness of an organization to look within your organization and honestly assess who you are as an organization and what your strengths are? Not what you think your strengths are, not what a consultant is telling you your strengths are, but what you know your strengths are. And can you build an organization from that core strength over time and build a strategy around that basic 10 core strength?
For budgeting, I would recommend that you not think of budgeting as standing alone as one thing. Budgeting is part of your entire organization. It is part of everything you do. If you have a strategic plan, then budgeting and strategic plan are intimately connected. They're not two separate things. This is something that organizations frequently make do a mistake, is that they make a plan, they make a budget, they make a performance program, and they never put them together. They're really one thing. They're not all these separate. And so strategic planning is a way of getting ready to do your organization's activities. Budgeting is a way to make sure you have the resources and you're not overreaching. Performance management is to make sure that you actually did what you did plan to do. So these are not independent things, and if you treat them as independent, you'll fall apart.
Great, thank you. And while you're speaking, I'm going to transition right into your presentation. Each of the panelists will give a 5 to 10 minute presentation, and then we'll follow it up with some questions from the attendees in the room or on the phone. Professor Williams, do you want to get started?
I just want to hear what you have to say. I will. I'm actually going to give probably a 3-minute presentation. So I've been thinking about budgeting in nonprofits. Most of the time I talk about budgeting in government, and most of the time I talk about the technical side of budgeting. I don't think you're really here to hear the technical side of budgeting. So I'll focus a little bit on the idea that the budget is not something to really be afraid of, as a lot of people are. And our students come, they have to take a budget course. That is not why they came to Baruch. They came to Baruch. I'm not really sure, actually. I've been here for 20 years. And I can tell you they didn't come to take a budget course. And so they come into my class, and they see there's going to be a little math involved, and they become very seized up about the math. Most budget math is not that hard. Budget math is not the same thing as statistics, which people do see stuff about. Not calculus, it's not string theory, for God's sake. It's really pretty simple math. So, one of the problems with budgeting is people become afraid of it as soon as they hear that that's what they're doing. Another problem with budgeting that I've encountered is that often there are activities you're doing for budgeting and don't even know that they're for budgeting. So, I mentioned performance measurement before. Performance measurement and budgeting are related. We're having trouble on the phone here. And I'm close enough to it that I can hear it. So all right, now I got to get my mind back together. So when you're in a management role, a large organization, I'm not sure how many people here have been in or presently in an organization of more than 50 people. Okay? Large organizations. They're not gigantic organizations, but they're pretty large. And if you're in a management role in a large organization and you go to your supervisor, your boss, whatever you call them, and talk to them about something that you think the organization should do, you might find at a later moment that your boss comes back to you, usually a week after you forgot all about that idea, and says, I talked to my boss about your wonderful idea, and we'd like to have a proposal in hand by Monday. You ever had that happen to you, or anything similar to that happen to you? Budgeting is the skill you need for that. Budgeting is the skill you need for that. You need to know how to express the idea. You need to know how to figure out what that costs. You need to know how to say it in a positive way so that you can communicate and promote that idea successfully, provided that the organization is willing to commit the resources necessary to get it to happen. So budgeting is that skill. That is what budgeting is about. I don't think I took 5 minutes, but that's my little talk.
Okay, so we'll move on and we can have the audience participate after Alan and Danette also present. So Alan, let me open up your presentation and you can just nod at me or tell me what's
Hi everybody. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and perspective first, which will explain this presentation a bit. I'm not a strategic consultant. My background is a background of a person who's a practitioner. I've done a lot of strategy work in the organizations that I've run. I've done a lot of turnarounds. I've done a lot of crisis management. I've done a lot of thinking about how you approach strategic planning. And what I want to talk about today is, let's say your specialty is not strategy, or let's say you think strategically, or let's say your specialty is not strategy and you don't think strategically. How should you approach that? You're a leader of a small organization, a medium-sized organization. It could be in a difficult context, it could be in a good context. What are some of the ways you should approach strategy and creating strategy? And what I'm going to talk about is the concept of creating strategy from the inside out. Let me tell you what I mean by inside out. It means that my philosophy is that the greatest strength of any organization is going to be found inside the organization itself. And great leaders, really, really great leaders, understand that. Find what's great about their organization. You can find a strategy that does that, you're going to be 90% down the line. Now I got to tell you that I've worked in turnarounds in which there wasn't a lot of strength when I went in. I ran a project in a country that I likened to complex working failure, where nothing was working. Their finance office was working. What do you do then? You still can find, even in the worst possible situations, even when people are threatening to cancel contracts because you're inheriting an organization that's just a basket case, you can always find areas of strength. And the key is to find those areas of strength, identify them, and build them. And that's really what strategy from the inside out means. How do you do that process? The first step is, you can go to the next slide. The first is what I call report your story. Before you even think about strategy, before you talk to a consultant, before you talk to your best friend who is a strategy consultant, the most important thing to do is to think about your organization and report your story. I used to be a journalist for many years, and these days journalists have kind of a bad rap, but in the old days, there was an idea that journalists were sort of unbiased observers, which we can get into another time. But the idea is when you actually report a story as a journalist, you're supposed to check your bias at the door. And that's exactly what you do in looking at your own organization. The most powerful thing you can do in reporting your story is look within your organization and really interrogate it. Interrogate the organization in a nice way. And think about, in a really brutal way, to use that phrase, what are we good at and what do we do? And really come to terms with that. And what I mean by that is, you may be at a nonprofit for you may have been in a nonprofit for 10 years, you may have been there 10 months, you may have been there 10 minutes. And I guarantee you that if you're there 10 minutes, you bring in a lot of bias. And the bias is from the outside. I don't like the way so-and-so looked at me. I don't think so-and-so is going to work out so well. You know, my finance controller, I'm not so sure I really like the cut of that person's jib. You know, the numbers really don't add up. You've been there 10 years. Our finance controller is the best person. We've worked together, 10 years. We do the same thing for 10 years. It's going really well. Those are all biases, and they're going to kill you when it comes to sort of thinking about your strategy. So once you sort of when you're reporting your story, you want to really think about the following. You want to identify what you're doing and how you're doing it. Okay. So if you're an organization, what's the what? What am I doing as an organization, and how am I doing it? And there's two parts to that. Okay. The how is very much culture. Okay. And I think that the most important attribute in any organization is culture. How's your organization working? How do people come to work? What's the dynamic when people come to work? Is it a good place to come to work every day? Are people laughing? Do they have good relationships? Is it a productive environment? That's extremely important, because if you kill that in the course of a direction, it's gone. Culture takes years to create an organization, years. And it takes about 5 minutes to destroy it. And so if you don't know how you do things and what your culture is at the outset, you're going to be really playing from behind. The second issue is you got to figure out what's your organization about. When I think of an organization and I think of strategy, I often think of how we think about product development, organizational management. So one, you want to think about what are my core assets? What do I do really well? But then you also want to think about, I don't know if you can see this. I can't see very well from here, but I'll just tell you what it says. I also want to think about what are your hidden assets. And hidden assets can be, hidden assets can be things, they can be people. They can be a person who's been working for you for 5 years and has been underutilized. And but has been essentially hiding in plain sight. They can be ideas that have been on the shelf. They can be anything. And the last part is the dormant assets, the thing you're not seeing every day, the thing you're walking by every day. And you really, when you report your story, you really want to get a really full sense of what those things are for your organization. Go to the next slide. After you've done all this reporting, you're going to have an enormous amount of data, and this is where the process gets really hard. You're going to be in the woods at that point. You're not going to really know, and you're going to be somewhat confused. You're going to be wrestling with it. And often what happens in strategic planning is there's a bias to complex. Even there's a bias to, well, what's our vision statement? What's our grand mission? And I'm actually a believer that you need to develop the one idea. If you think about great companies, they can always be summed up by one idea. Apple is a computer company. Starbucks is a coffee company. Samsung is an electronic device manufacturer. IBM these days is a service provider. Every company has a single identifiable idea that basically distinguishes them. IRC, where I work, is a service organization. What is that single idea that distinguishes your organization? And those are and how do you express it? And the reason why the single idea is important is that if your strategy is really complicated, you got two problems. One, it's probably really expensive. And the one thing you probably don't have is a lot of money. And the second thing, if it's really complicated, it's going to be really hard to explain. And if it's really hard to explain, no one's going to understand it, except you and your consultants who worked on it. or your best friend who you work out with. And that's going to basically undermine your strategy from the start. You go to the next slide. The next thing you want to do, and this is really an iterative process, is you want to test inside and out. What do I mean by that? We talked about budgeting. The most important thing, once you develop that one single idea and you know what your strategy is about, you got to run your budget numbers. How are we going to implement this? This is practical. You got to put an Excel together. You got to look at your revenue generation. You got to look at what grants you have coming in, and you got to test it inside. You've also got to test it with your people. What do you guys think about this? Do you understand this? What's the body language? And then fundamentally on the outside, you've got to test it with your market. If you're a nonprofit, you exist in a marketplace. That marketplace is not defined by profit and loss. It's defined by grants. It's defined by individual contributions. It's defined by a set of revenue that you rely on. Is this strategy going to work? Is it aligned where the financing is for your organization? If it's not, you got a problem. At that point, you want to go back, you want to retest, you want to think about your reporting again. It's basically an ongoing cycle. Once you've actually gone through this process, you figure you've got the one good idea, you figure you've identified what your core strengths of your organization, that's when you go to do something called rapid package. Every strategy, and this is, I think, a mistake that a lot of organizations make, is they go to the rapid package part before they do all the other sort of due diligence. And rapid package to me is almost like that's the easy part. What do I mean by rapid package? It's exactly what it means. It's how do I communicate it? How do I put a gloss on it? How do I market it? And I often think that that part is what how do I communicate it? If you've done all these other steps right, and you've really got that, if you tested it with the marketplace, if you've really done your upfront due diligence, rapid market should be 5 to 10% of your process. So I think, but I also think that this is the other thing I want to really emphasize is that this is an iterative circular process. So if you get to the rapid package part, and you're like, I have no idea I can't communicate this, then you've got a problem. You've got to go back to the start, think about it again, and re-outline until you get to something that's really at its core. So I just want to conclude by saying that I come at this from a perspective of the most important thing for me when I'm leading an organization. As I try to assemble the very best team possible. I try to assemble great teams. I think to me, that's fundamentally where you drive value from any organization. If you've got a great team, just about anything. But, I think fundamentally, you really want to build authentic strategy. And what authentic strategy means is it's not burst strategy, it's not chasing trends, it's not listening to sort of the latest management consultant idea about what makes strategy. Strategies grow from who we are as organizations, who we are as people, and who our people are. And if you root it in those fundamentals, you're going to create a strategy that basically is rooted back in the organization. And over the long term, that's going to build value for you. Because then people are going to understand it, it's going to be authentic. People are going to realize it's who we are as an organization. And the most important part is the process of change that strategy often brings with it, and is often the most scary for people, isn't going to be so scary. Because it's going to be unleashing the things that are fundamentally inside everyone in that organization that they see as the perspective and the potential of who they are as people, but also who they are as an organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That really resonates in terms of saying that people really matter. I think with any community, in the New York startup community, it's the team that matters. That's what investors invest in, and I think it's the same for nonprofits. That kind of the people is what makes the strategy and budgeting work. So I'm going to switch over to Jeanette's presentation now.
So we're going to talk a little bit about why the strategic plan is important. So strategic is a list of items why it's important. It is the organization's roadmap. So whenever you start your strategic plan, you have to think of this is where we are now, this is where we want to go, and how we're going to get there. And within that is your future goals, your fundraising plan, and your program implementation. Reinforce the path to the shareholders and the investors also. In my opinion, if you don't have a strategic plan, you don't have direction. So the benefits of strategic planning. So stimulate new approaches, increasing everyone's investment in the organization, develop common vision, clarify values and benefits, anticipate opportunities and obstacles, provide framework from day-to-day decisions, and creating more team funders. And you can ask questions about this. I'm going to just go through this pretty quickly. The 10 reasons why strategic plans fail. So this was done by Forbes, and there's a link on here. We're going to send these PowerPoints out to you also. So you can also go here and you can read all about why strategic plans fail. And mainly, it's that they're created and put on the shelf. So, and there's nothing done with them. One of the things that I have seen with shareholders and investors, like I said before, is they ask you to do one so that they can see what your path is. But they don't ever ask you in 6 months from now, hey, how's that strategic plan go? Are we on track? Are we implementing these things? Are we doing these things? They don't normally do that. Until the end of the year, when they want to see your budget and how you spent their money, and then if you're off, then they're like, what happened here? So that's one of the number one reasons, but they give you some other reasons why they also fail. So strategic plan versus project management. So strategic plan is how organizations define their objectives, values, missions, and other ways to achieve these, as Alan had spoken about. Project management is implement, motivating, controlling the resources, and making sure that it gets from point A to point B. So the benefits of project managing. So you make a list of tasks. You have a start date and a completion date. You have task managers who are responsible for completing the tasks and teams to carry out the tasks. This is where your team is very important to make sure that you have the right team in place to also implement this. And then having the visual timeline for each task. I know I went through that really quick, sorry. I just worry about timelines.
No, I think that was really great. I think, could you provide like a story or an example of a client you worked with in the nonprofit arena where you walk them through these steps?
So I'm gonna pick one of the education ones that I walked into. It's actually a turnaround. So I went into a nonprofit that was doing very poorly. I normally put into nonprofits like foundations. So they have the money they put into these nonprofits, and then they have me go in there and help them if they're in trouble, turn them around, or if they just need a little bit of help, I go in and help them with finance and operations. So we had one that was not doing very well. So I went in there, and one of the first things I do is I go in and I analyze what is the issue. Because just because the foundation thinks there's an issue, I need to find out what it is. So I go in there and I analyze everything that they're doing, what is right, what is wrong, and then also I analyze the staff, because it's really key is those hidden assets, because some people are put into a nonprofit when they're right out of college and they just keep being thrown tasks to do, but they've never given tasks to help them grow and be all they can be. So I also analyze all of the staff to make sure that they are in the right position, and maybe they can help in a different way than what they're already doing. And especially in a nonprofit, we're stretched, the resources are stretched so much. Sometimes one person's doing 3 different things, and one of those things they really hate doing. And this was one of the examples in the strategic planning. So once I go and analyze that, then I also analyze the financials, see where the budgeting is at, and why they're burning through so much money. Because that's normally one of the bigger problems why I put in there is they are just like, oh, we have all this funding, and they're just burning through money. So I always analyze and see what their burn rate is, and why are you burning so much money. And then I help negotiate contracts, because sometimes the contracts are the issue. Maybe sometimes they're paying too much interest, or whatever the case shall be. Or people, they get $100,000 for a program, and they're taking that money and they're using it somewhere else. One of the other things that I have noticed, especially in this case that I'm talking about, is there's this perception that nonprofits can't make profits. So how do you solve this problem? You have to have margins. So you have a program and that you're charging for, and you have your costs. Well, they're charging what their cost is and not putting a margin, a profit margin, whatever you want to call it. It's profit, but that profit goes towards operations. So at the end of the day, at the end of the year, are you making profit? No. But a lot of people think, oh, I can't charge more than what it costs because we'll get in trouble. That's not the case at all. So the money goes to operations, which is your administrative assistant, it's your rent, it's your utilities, it's the copier, those kind of expenses. So I find that's a lot of the issue on those. So once I do all of this, then let's create a strategic plan. So I sit down and we create the plan, we find out what is your strengths, your weaknesses, your threats, and we go through all of that and write it down. And just to let you know, a strategic plan is not something that you create overnight. It takes months to do it. Unless you're on some serious deadline. But it does, it takes like a long time because you're analyzing so much. And then you're taking everything that you analyze and you're putting that piece of pie together. And then you're implementing it. So there's a lot to this. So once you create the strategic plan and the budget to make sure that programs, and I always say, take it task by task and break it all apart into little pieces. So take a program, all your programs separate, and create its own budget. Don't create a whole budget for the organization if you have 10 programs. It's easier to take programs separately and then take all your different funding because you have restricted funds and unrestricted funds. So you have to make sure that you're spending that money on the program. And it's easier to break all of that apart from the budget. And then once you're done doing that and you make your strategic plan, then you can present it to your board, which is probably going to make tons of changes to it. And also make sure that your board also, this is very important, and do board training also, that they understand that they have a fiduciary responsibility to those fundings too, those budgets. But once the strategic plan is created, we went and implemented it. So once it was approved, I broke the plan apart again. So let's break it all apart. Let's create all the different programs that you have and then implement the strategic plan by department or by people. But make sure that you have the right people implementing it because it may just sit on their desk. So, and then I create a timeline that everyone can see, everyone can share, and then on a weekly basis or bi-weekly, depending on how intense this one project was very intense. So we did a weekly meeting. Everybody can see the timeline. Everybody can see what each other's doing, and everyone's held responsible on a weekly basis to make sure that it is implemented. And like I said, some things are on a shorter timeline than a longer timeline, which is why it's important to break the strategic plan apart after the implementation. And then it's just easier to get that done if you break it apart. And then once all the departments can see each other, I think it's just easier to make sure that everything is getting done. But then there's also somebody being held responsible. And you can tell your board, this is how I broke it apart. These are the people that are responsible for it, and just tell them how things are going as it's going. Also, your investors will also appreciate that. Sometimes investors want to know, and sometimes they're the ones that are asking for it because they may feel that their money isn't spent well, or especially when you have foundation money and if the foundation is funding the organization majority, then you are the ones who
Thanks, Danette. So I think that's great ideas on managing larger organizations, and I know Alan asked how many of you have worked with in 50 or more. How many of you are working in organizations that are 10 or less? How about 100 or more? So we have a few that are very large. So I'd love to hear from the panelists a little bit about how strategy and budgeting may differ for a brand new startup versus a mid-sized one versus a large one, and as you compare the scale, what should we think about?
Yeah, I've only worked I haven't worked at a sort of classic startup, but I've started up offices and organizations. Budgets are fundamentally navigational documents, and the budgets are your fundamental document for accountability on a couple of fronts. So it's the most important, the budget process and the finance process is the most important process in any organization to get right. If everything else is going wrong and your finance office is going right, you can do something. If your finance office is going wrong and everything else is going right, you got huge problems. And the reason for that is because that budget data is the most reliable source of data you're going to have. For example, if you have a grant of $1 million and it's a 12-month grant, and then in month 9 you come into the office and in month 9 your burn rate's 0, as in you burned nothing, you have a problem. That's a very simple example of how you can keep your office accountable. If you're burning too hot, then there might be something wrong overall. That's a good way to get a snapshot. The other thing is that budgets also provide you, if you have good real-time data, they tell you exactly how your people are spending their programs. So if you set up your grant right, you've got a 12 to 18 month, to get a 12 to 18 month grant, you've done, the upfront budget planning with the grant opening meeting, you understand what the goals of the project manager are, and then at month 6, there's certain budget lines should be spent that aren't being spent. It's the greatest tool you have to start to call a meeting and figure out what's going on. So, I can't emphasize enough the fact that the budget and good financial data is really a key to core accountability. It's also, frankly, it's the reality check in any strategy, which is that I can go up with a great strategy that's ultimately going to fail because it can't be funded. And, I think if you can't test your strategy with a good budget, as they say, forget about it. You're not going to get anywhere. So, that's why I love budgeting. It's the place where it's not just where the rubber hits the road. It's where reality smacks you in the face in a good way. So it's a really important part of the process.
So we have an activity here at Baruch once a year called Consulting Day. Jack, what's called in the back is responsible for it. And in that, I talk to people who are, in fact, at the stage of starting up their organizations. And in reality, there are many who probably have to do some more thinking before they have a successful organization. But when I talk to them, I find that budgeting is often their chief concern, if not their chief concern, probably getting their tax papers filed for their 501c3 is their chief concern. But budgeting is pretty close to their chief concern. And so I see a couple things about these organizations. Probably about half of them have at least learned to acquire software like QuickBooks or something like that to at least keep track of what's happening with their money. And then half of them have not. And those are probably the ones that are going to have the biggest part of the problem, biggest problems going from thinking about starting up to actually starting up. And then, so when you talk to them about what they do with QuickBooks, they often find out that, yeah, they put a record in QuickBooks as to what they spent their money about last week. But they never set up the budget for the QuickBooks. They never set their plan out. They don't really know what they're intending to spend money on, except that they know, we sort of do this a little bit and do that a little bit. And have some, usually really small startups don't have any paid employees. And they're still at the stage of having a volunteer staff. And they may be thinking, I would like to have a paid employee. And typically the person they want paid is themselves. And they don't know how to plan for paid employees. Or if they do have paid employees, they don't realize that a large part, typical service organizations, somewhere above 80% of their budget, somewhere above 70% short, is going to be those paid employees. So they need to think about that. And they don't have a lot of insight into that at the startup side. So those are some problems to solve in order to go from thinking about starting up to actually starting up.
So I work with a lot of startups, and one of the things that, especially with nonprofits, the first thing I talk to them about is filing their nonprofit status. They don't realize how expensive that is. The 1023 application is lengthy. You have to have an attorney. You don't have to have an attorney. It's highly advised to have an attorney review it, even if you fill it out yourself. I fill them out, and I still have an attorney that fill them out. I'm probably at least the best. So it's important to do that. Make sure you have enough money for that. And I see a lot of people, they try to do budgets without even really doing a strategic plan or a business plan. So you have to figure out what you're doing, where you're at, where you're going, before you can create a budget. You can't have one without the other, period. Backwards or backwards or backwards or frontwards. That's just the bottom line. But also to Dan's point, you have to know where your numbers come from. So you have to, whenever you do a budget for employees, future employees, you have to make sure that you know those numbers, their benefits, what the taxes, the salary, all of that has to go into your budget. You have to make sure that those numbers are really strong in the background, and know where they're all coming from. You can't say, oh, well, we have this program and I think we're going to charge $10 a person. It doesn't work like that. You have to know what's the competitive advantage, what's everyone else doing. You have to really think about those numbers before you create them. Because when you go to your funders, they're going to ask you how you came up with those numbers. How did you come up with this plan? You have to have a mission. I help start schools, charter schools. And the same thing goes for them. When we start a charter school, the finances are the most important, but also the plan is too.
So there's a question about actual versus projected budgets, and how do you project a budget and be accurate about it? And can you share some tactics and specific advice on what you've done in the past to forecast, as well as I know this might be a financial class, I don't know, but
just a quick thing. You're gonna have every budget's gonna have real expenses that you're gonna have month to month. Those are the most obvious to project. So for example, you're gonna have salaries, that's month to month costs, right? Most difficult to project are programmatic costs that are fungible over time. My advice, what I always try to do is I always try to get my teams to project month to month by quarter, but really ultimately by quarter. So they put together projections by quarter. When I say to people put a spending plan together, has everybody in this room put a spending plan together for their organizations? Has everyone done that? And how do you do you do it by quarter? How do you view your projections? Monthly, right? How difficult is it to do monthly projections for you? On a scale of 1 to 10 being most difficult. I think it's if you're looking at the costs that sit outside your monthly costs, like your salaries and stuff that are pass-through costs, I've never seen a budget that stuck to a monthly projection in terms of project teams, and at least in my environment. And the reason for that is that people are always putting unrealistic assumptions, or in the international world, stuff happens a lot that's just highly disruptive. And that's okay, but the point of it is that you got to put the initial numbers down and figure out what you're doing, but you also have to be prepared to be flexible and to constantly you have to be constantly forecasting. I think on a monthly or quarterly basis. I always try to do monthly projections and find them incredible. I always have my teams do monthlies, but at the end of the day, if I'm on target for a quarter, that's okay.
Well, I have a different view of this. There are no correct budgets. Zero. Don't even think about having a correct budget. Budgets are reasonable. If they're reasonable, you've got a good budget. If you're trying to be perfect, I'll leave it alone. If you're trying to be perfect, you're just not going to get there. So just don't bother. What you're trying to do is make a reasonable estimate that has good reasons for being made and expect to not be right. You should expect to not be right. So, in your world, unless you give benefit to somebody else, or unless you buy something very expensive, most of your budget is going to be what you pay employees. That's just it. Most of your budget will be what you pay employees. The next largest thing is going to be, presuming that you have to pay rent. That's going to be it. That's the next largest thing. Well, some people run their organizations out of their homes. They're really small. Some people run medium-sized things where they have in-kind donation of their location. Everybody else pays rent, unless they own their capital business. It's very unlikely for smaller organizations. If you can get your salaries right and your rent right, those you can be almost exactly right. Rent you should be exactly right, unless your lease is up this year. Your salaries you ought to be close to right, won't be exactly right. You should be close to right. If you get those right, then you're going to be pretty well off in your budget. You've got a small range, maybe 10, maybe 20% of your budget is left for other things. Not a very large part. Being right there is good. Being close to right there is good. But being exactly right is not good. You should expect to never be exactly right. In terms of, so you're now in the year and you spent a little bit of money and it's not on track. The important thing to know, there are two important things. One is to realize you're probably not going to be that close to on track in the first couple of months of the year if you're budgeting by the year. If you're rebudgeting every quarter, then that's slightly different. But if you're budgeting by the year, you're probably not going to be exactly right at the beginning of the year. You shouldn't be excited about it. As you progress, you should become closer and closer to exactly right. Well, never exactly. You get closer and closer to right. The second, what's your name?
Back down to one thing. And if you think of it, you can pop it back up. So I think another question that was prevalent in the audience is about stakeholders and buy-in. That's different numbers. How does that play into strategic planning and budgeting? Getting the right people on board.
In what context?
I think how do you so if you're looking to get everyone on board with the budget, or you're looking
talking about
exactly stakeholders.
I think I'm a big believer in fundamentals, and fundamentals are about explanation. So, but be careful. So, for example, I don't think that everybody in your organization really wants to use your budget. It depends on how big you are, right? So, if you're 3 people, then you can all sit in a room and look at your budget. If you're 100 people, it becomes more difficult. So, the first thing is on the finance side. I think there's a certain level of trust in leadership. If you are a big organization, you need that. And I think that I think great leadership is incumbent on all of us as leaders of organizations to take the time to work people through what it is you're doing and narrate them along the journey where you're taking them. Now, that's a fundamental. Everybody in the room would probably go, oh yeah, that's pretty obvious. I think where it falls down is that if you're an exec director for an organization, chances are you're working 12, 14 hours a day. Chances are you're not getting paid enough. Chances are you're trying to raise a family while you're working 12 or 14 hours a day and working 7 days a week. And that's where the fundamentals get killed. When you're in an international environment, you're often dealing with crisis all the time. You're tired all the time. And you just don't have the time to communicate with your team. So the quickest thing that happens is you stop communicating, you don't take the time, you don't repeat, you don't go back to fundamentals. And I think that's where things really fall down. So my advice is always be really cognizant of how much time it takes to walk people through what you're doing, how much time it takes to repeat and communicate, and then repeat again, and how much time it takes to develop simple messaging and you have to go out again and bring people through that journey. Chances are that you think you communicated it, you probably should double, triple, quadruple the amount of time you're communicating to people, because they probably haven't done it. And we've all seen these studies about how people get about 10 or 20% the first time. So I mean, I think the lesson for me is never underestimate the time you have to spend with your people to really take them through what you're doing. When you're getting really tired, chances are you're probably going to shortchange yourself, and that's the time you really have to dig in and be patient and actually get back with your team and make sure they're going to do very well.
And I agree with that. I always have to report out to boards and stakeholders about the projections. And to what everyone has said up here, they are their projections. There's no perfect 3-year projection or 1-year projection. Catastrophic disaster can happen in millions, or so many things can happen within that year. But explaining what you're going to do to your stakeholders, I think is really important, and to be able to convey to them what you're going to do. That's why the numbers are important, to know where you want them. Because if you have a program and we say, okay, we want to raise $100,000 for this program. Okay, well, let me explain it to you. You have to explain it in detail, the program first, and then the numbers. Okay, this is how it's going to work. And if it makes sense and they trust you, then it's okay. And if it's off a little bit at the end, you report out to the board normally on a quarterly basis, if not more, depending on how big your organization is. But you tell them as you go, this is what's going on, this is how things are going. And if something major happens, then you tell them as you go. And then it's okay that you're out of budget. You just got to find money somewhere. You still have money at the end. But I think explaining it over and over until they understand, because a lot of the stakeholders may be like a marketing person, but they may not understand the program. So like we had a program where we teach principals to be principals, so that we can put new principals all through the state that it's working. They didn't understand the program. They didn't understand what we were doing. And that's okay. If you sit there and explain it to them a little bit in detail, and how you're going to charge for this, and what part the school's going to pay, what part do you need to raise, and just explain everything in detail to them, then they'll start to get it. And if not, then the trust really goes into the person, to the executive director, and the people who are reporting out. They trusted me with the finances, so they understood where I was coming from, and the executive director, and they just like, okay, we trust you. So.
Just one thing. Ask yourself this question: does your board understand your organization?
Yeah.
Now, you make the assumption. I mean, everybody assumes that the board of directors understands the organization that they're running, but they are actually, the board is usually the most powerful and most divorced from the day-to-day operation of what you do. So, do you have to explain to the board what your organization is about? Do you have to take them through that? Understanding them as an audience is extremely important. And boards often don't understand what their organization is about, particularly when they grow really big, really fast. You may have a board member that's been on your board for 10 years. He or she may remember what the organization is about, but things have moved on now. So have you taken that board on that journey? And have you brought them up to speed about what's going on? I mean, it's about explaining the budget, yes, but it's also about saying, actually, you've changed. Maybe the people that you serve have changed. Maybe your client base has changed. Maybe your mission has changed. I mean, maybe your financial diversity has changed, and the board just hasn't been paying attention. So taking the time to really walk them through that and walking them through that strategically is important. And I'm constantly asking the question, does my board actually understand who I am, who we are as an organization? It's equally important.
Definitely going back to the fundamentals.
So, something I noticed about many small organizations' budgets, which is different from government budgets, I know you're not in government, but sometimes you can learn, is that the budget shows what you want to spend for the upcoming year, and that's about it. So, in governments, budgets usually show shown what you also spent last year compared to what you asked for last year, how well you did, and how much you changed into this year's budget. So if you show that kind of information to your decision maker, first of all, if they see how well you did, they may be much more willing to trust that you know what you're doing this year. To show how you've changed, they better understand what's happening in your organization now. So budgets, it's important what information your budget contains. And that's an example of the kind of additional information you can put in your budget, or if you prefer some sort of simple numbers type budget, you can put it in a separate piece of paper that you can give to your board at the same time, your decision makers at the same time you prepare your budget. You can give them more information, and they have a better chance of understanding what you're doing.
Absolutely. So getting the board involved is part of addressing the stakeholder issue. I think I didn't mention at the beginning, this is actually our fourth nonprofit executive director meeting. Some of the other topics we've covered to this point were partnerships, marketing for nonprofits, as well as fundraising for nonprofits. And that one was in particular interesting. And I think strategy and budgeting and planning encompasses all of those. And especially with funding and fundraising, that's always an issue that people are asking. How do you tie your fundraising efforts with your budget and your strategy? So I think that will be my last question to the panel, and then we'll open it up to the board.
I think the strategy is part business plan, and that strategy needs to reflect your aspirations, and those aspirations are reflected in the amount of money that you're going to raise. And I think what I was getting at in terms of the testing part was, do you know as an executive leader, as an executive director, as a director of an organization, do you know what the trends are in your area and where the potential funding is? That's the first thing to ask. If you know that, to what degree does my strategy have to reflect that or not? Now, what I mean by the have to reflect that or not is, if you have a strategy that's unfundable, well, then you have an unfundable organization. So that's fairly obvious. But your strategy has to be rooted towards a funding strategy, which means that to a certain extent it has to correspond with a significant amount of funding that's out there that's going to be able to support your aspirations.
I think that would be great if you come up to the microphone if you have a question or if you want to share something with the group. I'm opening up the floor for the next 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Please go to the microphone and introduce yourself again and your organization. You can say a little bit about what you do and then any questions or things to add to the conversation.
All right, I'm Gary Oppenheimer. I'm the founder and executive director of AmplesHarvest.org. Very quickly, it's a national program in all 50 states that is enabling 42 million home community gardens who have too much food to find the people to donate to a local food pantry on a national basis to end the waste of food, which is a really cool idea that has no schema. It's never been done before. So going to the foundation, the funding role to say we've got a great model, a great program, everybody in the White House down loves it, but around funding silos has been our biggest headache. But the other question I want to start with, you made a really important question. We're doing a foundation grant thing right now. It's about the profit adding up to your operations cost. Would you, when you have a project, and by the way, AmplesHarvest.org is the project, which is the other problem. It's a very return. When you present the budget to the foundation, would you say this is the project cost and we're tacking on the 20% it costs to operate the organization, or as a separate line item so they can see distinctly, or would you just mush it all in together? So the two questions are, how do you address that issue? And the bigger one is, how do you address the realm of solving a problem that nobody ever knew existed?
Well, do you charge for the program?
No, you can't.
No.
The stakeholders, in this particular model, the stakeholders are two parties that cannot fund. 42 million gardeners who would like to donate food, but they're not going to pay to donate, and food pantries that are in no position to pay for freely available food in the community.
So you would be 100% funded?
We have to go out and beg for money.
Okay, then you just have operational costs.
Yes.
There is no margin.
We're not.
Because you're not charging for anything.
That's correct. The cost of actually managing the technology and everything is our cost.
So that would just be in your budget. That would be operational costs within a budget.
But I would say two things on that foundation. One is that you want to represent those costs as what I think of as below the line. That's not traditional below the line, but I represent it as below the line. So when we budget for staff and office, and then we budget for programs. But you can budget all of those costs as programmatic costs. You can represent them as programmatic costs. And there's various ways to budget for that. For example, you can present your budget as an output-based budget to donors so that you're basically showing what your outputs are and you're associating with those costs. That's one way to represent it. A lot of donors won't accept it, but you can try it. You can look at all of your cost bases. You're probably going to have a high staff and office cost if you represent it one way. But if you actually say, these are true programmatic costs, represent them that way, that looks better for the donor. And then you can charge an overhead rate. So your overhead rate, let's say, is donors are traditionally understand the concept of overhead rates. So you wouldn't have a kind of a standard negotiated overhead rate, but you can say my overhead rate is 10% and the rest is programmatic. And so by representing the budget that way, you're able to say to your potential donor, we have a 90-10 split. 90% of everything we do goes into our programmatic costs, and 10% goes into our back office costs. And the advantage of that also is that the biggest trick in budgeting is you want to show as few inputs to the donor as possible. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? The best budget for a donor is they're going to give me $100 and they're going to tell me to spend it however you want. Okay, that's the best budget. No one ever does that, but that would be the dream, right? I've actually seen a budget like that. So you get $100, they don't tell you how to spend it. So the trick is you really want to create a budget for a donor that shows as much programmatic costs as possible because they don't want to pay for your back office, right? They want to pay for your copy. And you can represent it that way and really show them that every dollar they're spending is going into cost. And then figure out what your true back office cost is. And the back office cost could be, well, how much am I paying for my copier? What am I paying for am I a back office cost or am I a front office cost? They don't want to pay for your fundraising costs, but you're going to have to do fundraising costs. That comes out of your indirect, for example. So just break those down that way. And then play around with how to represent the budget a little bit so that it looks really cool. Like, okay, you're for every $100 you spend, $90 is going into your pocket of X, Y, Z. Okay. Thank you.
We're having our next speaker for questions for the audience. My name is Vera, and I just recently founded TrueLegal, which is dedicated to supporting individuals in leading happy, healthy, meaningful lives, and trying to promote a more comprehensive vision of wellness that includes social emotional wellness and takes health down to an everyday level. And as a new organization, I'm curious to see if you have any views on what you would suggest as a good allocation for different expenses. I know some people ascribe to specific, you shouldn't have overhead costs or administrative costs go beyond X percent, whereas other people are saying, well, staff is most important, so you can spend more on that. So I'm just curious what you view as an appropriate kind of way to go about those forecasts.
I understand.
So the question is being should you limit your costs to?
Yes, I understand the question. I would say that I'm going to give you the analogy from the international world. If my staff and office costs are going above 25 or 30%, that's probably bad. So if you, but let me explain what staff and office is, and let me explain what actually programmatic costs are. The staff and office cost is my finance person. It's my head of admin. Okay, that's a traditional staff and office cost. No one wants to pay for that, right? But they also appreciate you got those costs. A program cost would be your project manager, the person who's actually running the programs, right? That would be a traditional program cost. If your staff and office costs are above 25-30%, including your overhead rate. Okay, so traditionally you'd have an overhead rate. Does that make sense? So X percentage of the budget, it's coming into my pocket, and I can spend however I want as long as I'm spending that fundamentally on operations, right? And above that, you might structure your budget so that you then have a budget line for your finance person, for your admin person, if you're that, if you're working at that level. But if those back office costs are going up 25%, that's going to be very difficult for the government to swallow. Because you just have to look at it from their perspective. They don't want 25%, they love to see 15%. But if you're a young organization, you're going to have high overhead because you don't have a lot of other projects, right? If that's your only project, you've got to pay for your salary, you got to pay for everybody else's salary. So I think it's a reasonable starting point. And again, if you can push it down, great. But if it's, if it goes to about 25%, I think it's probably excessive.
I'm Kano from the Statue of Liberty Foundation. One of the components we talk about is people, getting people to be able to build a strategy, be able to have time to build a strategy, and how do you try to get people to think about it and spend time to do an appropriate strategic plan. Because I find being at this organization, in a new organization, it's very complacent when they are. I've come from other places where, strategic planning is every year, related to our budget. So, how do you approach that?
Some organizations just don't believe them and don't do them. If you're not the executive director, I'm not sure how you would. You can go and talk to them and tell them what the importance of them are. You can take my little PowerPoint with you, but and I've run into plenty of relationships what you're doing is working, so why break it? So
there is another part here, which is if you're the head of a smaller unit, you have a strategic plan for your unit, even if the organization doesn't have a strategic plan for that. Now, if you're just yourself, there's not much point in it. But if you have people who report to you, have an organizational component, you can have a strategic plan for your organizational component. And maybe if it makes it look like you're doing a better job, it will catch on culturally in the organization. However, it is the head of the organization or the board, but most likely the head, who makes the decision to really push strategic planning into your organization.
I feel that each department really, their mission should hold up to the main mission. And, I think the efficiency of each department should be helped by about their strategic plan of each department I recently got promoted and I now run 4 departments. And I want to try to organizationally have a strategic plan that covers each department. But, talk about people, having the right people in the right spots, and also having everybody buy into doing it. What I'm trying to struggle.
I just want to. Do you have a culture problem or a strategy problem? So problem. Right, you have both, right? You can't do strategy if you don't have good culture. You can do a strategic plan, but I think, I want to be really clear, I'm totally not contradicting your point. It's just like, if it's not, you can't operationalize it, it has no value. And if you don't have the culture to operationalize it, you're not going to be able to have a good strategic planning process, right? So, if you have an organization where you don't have people motivated, you don't have people who have a vision, whatever it is, I'm not saying that's your organization or not, I just think you can be the best strategy sessions imaginable, you're not going to get anywhere. So I think it's a sequencing issue, right? So if you feel like, man, there's just a morale issue here, people are not motivated, or there's a toxicity, that's a really difficult environment to bring forward planning into. And you almost have to address that issue first before you get to the forward planning part. I don't know if that's the answer you want to hear. But it's you gotta create the right environment or else you're not gonna get better pushing forward. Yeah, exactly.
So I think we have one more question from David and one more question from Carol, And then there were a few people who came in late that I'd like to introduce yourself, your name and your organization. So we'll end with the 2 questions, introduce the people who came in late, as well as anyone on the phone, and then we'll wrap up and.
Great. I have a question that also concerns strategic planning. Strategic planning is one of the topics that I cover in my classes for a number of years, and I poll students about what their experience with strategic planning is. And a very common theme for many years is that most of our students are mid-level, so people in nonprofit organizations. Those people that feel that they were at that level included in the strategic planning process invariably have a more positive feeling about the process, and invariably are more bought into the plans after they came out. Those people that felt like the strategic plan was really something that was almost entirely hashed out by senior administration, and that sort of just presented to them for approval if it was presented at all. And so I like to talk about strategic planning as an opportunity for organizational deliberation. It's done in a good way, in an honest way. It's a time when people at all levels of the organization can have some input into the direction that the organization is going to go. So my question to the panelists is, what are some of the best ways to make that happen without leadership completely getting up control?
The first thing I want to say is that if you're going through a strategy process, you're the leader, you're not scared, there's something wrong. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the most vulnerable place you can be in an organization is opening yourself up to change and listening to your team and cracking open things. And the reason I'm answering the question that way is because if you come in with this idea that I'm going to create a strategy, but I'm going to consult people, that's way that we're my idea. People will be really psyched about it when they're in that process of actually giving feedback, but when it comes to unveiling your plan and their ideas aren't represented, they're really pissed off. People are smart. They're just going to be really resentful. So, I mean, I think the key is there's no shortage of an authentic process. And I think going back to your point, which is that if you have a culture issue, maybe the strategy is a change process. And it can also be a tool and a mechanism for cracking open what's been dormant in the organization for a long time. It can also unleash the culture, and that's scary. And that's just scary, That is that you can find things you don't want to find, and that's why people really are fearful of it. At the same time, you can find stuff that is amazing and cathartic, right? So the stuff you thought was really scary isn't so scary. So I guess the way to answer it is, open processes are really tough. Don't realize they're tough, because they are. Your job's on the line, your credibility's on the line. You're really naked out there with your people, but they're really important. And I think it's really important also to create that level of authentic leadership with your people by going through the process.
I agree, and I think that communication is key to whenever you start this process. Let everybody know what you're doing as you're doing it. Because when people don't know, they get even more scared. And then they think, oh my God, I'm going to get tired of our ideas. Then you open up so many more, or if you don't include people, why am I not included in here? So I think it's important to include everybody. You have to break it down department if you're really large. But also communicate through the entire process, just so that people don't feel that. Because it is a process that encompasses everything, including the executive director.
Thank you very much for all your comments. Carol Seeger, the COO for Center to Advance Accountability Care Work. I'm not sure if 25-person staff is considered medium, so it might be a small meeting. And I've actually changed my comments and my questions a couple of times. This last conversation was really wonderful. And I guess, there's a lot of literature and evidence out there on strategic planning, how to do it right. And budgeting, it makes all of us nervous, but when it comes right to just sitting down and doing the right thing, going through it, being rigorous, and matching stuff up, the real difficulties is around the managing strategic plan, how to embrace opportunistic use the word opportunistic, which can blow up a strategic plan at times. Project management staff pushing it up against the people who are the idea creators. We hear that all the time. Great idea, but just implementing that idea. But my question to you is I find the small and medium-sized nonprofits that there's a lack of leadership training. All the stuff we talked about, being open, communicating, all of these are not easy, they're not complicated, and most I have found leaders, myself included, come to the table and have none of the skills to actually do that and do that well. And there's a lot of ugly trial and error that happens. So what I'd like to ask the group is, what are the, I know there are consultants, so with all due respect, but are there electronic training vehicles that leaders, not-for-profit leaders, can be accessing to? Because this is all tough stuff. The budget is actually easy. Managing the project management staff and making it all happen in a way that improves culture, enhances culture, makes it better. All of this is high-level stuff. And, too many people really don't know how to do it and do it well. So I was wondering if you had recommendations about places where folks could go to learn this skills.
I want to make a comment first. I teach online courses a lot, so I want to start with that. Some things are interpersonal. And interpersonal things really are not an online electronic skill. Just want to emphasize that.
And it might be an awareness, so people are aware that this is tough and to be thoughtful about how you do it. And some of it might just be always raising awareness that we might not always be doing in this world.
There's, I know there's one that's called Course, I can't think of the name off the top of my head. But they offer courses just like this, and they're free to nonprofits. If you send me an email, my email's on the PowerPoint, and I can give you my card. I can direct you to a few of those where you can take online courses, how to do it. There's also one for board training. They have tons of them, and they're focused just for nonprofits.
That might be a good session for us too to do a leadership training.
Yeah, I think so. I was going to suggest that too. That's a skill set that's light.
But the main thing is the leader has to be a skilled leader. I don't know any other. I mean, I walked into, so for instance, some of the nonprofits that I worked with, they're in the education sector. So the executive director was a PhD in education, but knew nothing about running a company or an organization. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. I don't care how you slice and dice it, at the end of the day, you can bring in really good executive teams, but when you're that small, when you're 10, 15 people, and you don't know what here's a financial projection, and you're looking at it upside down and it still looks the same, that's a problem.
The not-for-profit world is filled with leaders who are passionate about the mission, that are content experts, but do not have the business skills, and it does complicate management for leaders who might not be the executive. And when your leader's the content expert, you do not.
And that's more common than you actually think.
I
worked in Pittsburgh, and they brought me to Delaware because they didn't have someone that had finance and operations, and they brought people. I actually brought 3 people from Pittsburgh to Delaware because the leaders couldn't be leaders. So I brought myself and other people into organizations to run the organization. It works. It's just not the ideal way, in my opinion.
So can you say one last quick sentence for the group, and then we'll introduce the people who came in late and wrap up.
Just something. There's so many good resources out there. I love Harvard Institute of Leaders. There's just always great stuff. There's tons of books out there to read, to think about organizational change, organizational management. Not just online courses that are around. So much cool stuff to help you think about how you lead your organization these days, and theories about flat organizations, etc. Agile development systems are around there. Just really fun to get into and think about it, how you can improve the way you lead organizations, how you
and getting really honest, the strategic great feedback.
Yeah, I mean, there's all tools. I mean, everything from mindfulness management, which I love. You know, like there's so much cool stuff going on right now. That if you want to be a great leader, you want to access, you know, interesting ideas about how to be a great manager, they're out there for you to see.
And they're really good too. I mean, I take my continuing education all the time. I take support. And so they're yeah, like too.
We want to continue to compile these resources, and we're working on a website that we'll share with everyone as well. So we'll start putting some of these together to have access on an ongoing basis.